5 FW-190s. Diving fast, altitude 11,400 feet, speed 330 mph. Their prey, a lone P-38 Lightning caught in a wide escort orbit. Pilot Lieutenant Owen Hall, 21 years old, first combat patrol, flying without his section lead, shot down 90 seconds prior. His radio crackled static, then died, with no call-out and no backup. Hall had exactly 6.8 seconds before the first German guns came into range. His only option, a turn. But not just any turn. What Hall pulled was something no Lightning pilot was supposed to attempt: the split bank counter flare. It combined a high-speed stall onset with an aggressive opposite bank, breaking every rule of compressibility safety above 10,000 feet. It had been banned after one test aircraft nearly disintegrated in 1942. The manuals called it suicidal. But in the next 11 seconds, 5 separate attacks would fail. One German would overshoot, another would spin out. The Luftwaffe would call it impossible, and German Air Command would ignore the reports until it happened again. Brittany coast, France, June 1944, anti-shipping escort mission. They had laughed at the Lightning long before Lieutenant Owen Hall ever flew it in combat. In German pilot briefings from late 1943, the P-38 was dismissed as predictable, oversized, and fragile in close combat. FW-190 pilots mocked its turn radius over 1 mile 200 yards at 270 mph and its sluggish response once compressed above 20,000 feet. One German report summarized it bluntly: "The twin-boom fighter cannot evade once forced into a turn. American instructors weren't much kinder." At gunnery school, Hall had been shown charts highlighting compressibility zones between 260 and 300 miles mph, where elevator forces increased by more than 40% and roll authority dropped sharply. The warning was underlined twice in the Lightning manual: "Do not flare or bank aggressively at high speed. Structural failure or total control loss probable." That wasn't theory. In 1942, a test pilot attempting a flare bank at 285 mph had nearly lost the aircraft when the nose locked and the left flap jammed. The maneuver was struck from consideration and effectively banned. Hall heard all of it. He was 21 years old, with just 140 hours in type, still adjusting to asymmetric thrust and the Lightning's long moment arm. During a training sortie in March 1944, he'd tried a shallow flare while banking at 270 mph and felt the aircraft lurch sideways. His instructor snapped over the radio: "Never do that again." The debrief was worse. Hall was told flatly, "If you try that in combat, it will kill you." From that day on, the maneuver had a reputation. Pilots called it reckless. Engineers called it non-repeatable. Command called it banned. The Lightning, they said, was built to dive and extend, not to flare and slide. If caught by FW-190s, you ran. You never turned inside them. And yet, Hall couldn't forget what he'd felt in that moment at 278, maybe the brief sideways slip. The sudden loss of the enemy's imaginary gun line. It hadn't felt like a stall. It felt like the geometry broke. But there was no place for that thought in doctrine. So Hall kept quiet. He flew escort. He held formation. He followed orders. Until June 1944, when over the Brittany coast, at 11,400 feet, 5 FW-190s forced him into the exact situation the manuals warned about. No altitude to dive, no room to run. A turn was inevitable, and the one turn he wasn't allowed to make was suddenly the only one left. Then the Germans changed their attack pattern at 330 mph and made the last safe option useless. The P-38 Lightning was not a turn fighter. It was designed to intercept bombers at altitude, to dive fast and climb hard on turbo-supercharged twin engines. It could hit 414 maybe in level flight, and its twin Allison V-1710s gave it a climb rate of 300 F to min. But when cornered, it showed its flaws. Its flat turning radius at 270 mm exceeded 1/200 yards, nearly twice that of the BF-109 and 42% worse than the FW-190A. Its long wings and high wing loading made it too stable. In slow-speed scissors, it lost angles. In high-speed turns, it lost control. And yet, the Lightning had one strange quirk. At a narrow envelope between 265 and 282 mph, if the pilot cut throttle and input opposite aileron and elevator while slightly banking, the airframe didn't stall immediately. Instead, it entered a lateral yaw roll brief, violent and unpredictable. Engineers at Lockheed called it an aerodynamic discontinuity. Test pilots called it the side flare. No one used it in combat. The timing was nearly impossible. At above 285 mph, control lock began. Below 265, the maneuver bled too much energy. If attempted improperly, the result was often a flat spin or a compressibility stall. In 1943, one pilot had tried it during a training dive. He induced a flare at 280 mph, overbanked, and lost rudder authority. The aircraft rolled into a right yaw and entered a compressibility dive, and the plane blacked out. The pilot ejected at 8,000 feet survived, but was grounded permanently. From that point, the maneuver was written off, but Hall remembered the numbers. At 10,000, 13,000 feet, in clear air, with speed above 270 but below 283, and if roll and rudder were oppositional but timed right, just for a moment the Lightning could rotate 40, 50 degrees off its vector. That break in geometry made tracking fire lines collapse. The Germans didn't know about it. Why would they? No one used it. Instead, they studied standard Lightning patterns, dive breaks, power dives, slow vertical yaws. The Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine assumed the P-38 would run, not turn. Their attack pattern, multi-angle lead fire at predictable break arcs, was designed around that, and that assumption made them vulnerable, because when Hall pulled the move in combat, it didn't look like a tactic. It looked like a mistake, but a mistake with just enough numbers behind it to work. Then 5 German fighters entered from high crescent angle, 900-yard spread, at 330 mph and started compressing the attack cone by the second. Hall saw them, knew what was coming, and chose the one thing he'd sworn not to do, flare at speed, at 17,400 feet. Hall's Lightning was running an elongated left orbit, holding escort pattern near a coastal bombing lane. Below, 3 squadrons of B-26s were forming up. Above, nothing on radar. Visibility stretched 9.2 miles, just enough to see the dots. 5 of them, dark specks, closing fast from high 3 o'clock. FW-190s. Hall radioed a contact call, but nothing came back. His RT was out. It had been sputtering since engine start. He banked right to check 6 too late. They were descending already, stacked in a crescent 2 lead attackers, 2 support fighters above, 1 trailing wide. Entry vector 11,000 feet, angle down at 18 degrees, closing speed 330 mph. Engagement in less than 7 seconds. The P-38's bubble canopy gave him wide field of view, but the wings blocked his low rear quadrant. He glanced down. His escort flight was gone. He was alone. Attack geometry confirmed it, standard German bracket. Lead pair would enter low oblique, forcing Hall to dive. Top pair would cross behind him if he did. Tail fighter would finish from above. Classic scissor. Hall couldn't dive. Below him, cloud cover at 14,000 feet. Light buildup. If he punched through, he'd lose visual no good. He tried to roll for speed. Nose dipped. Airspeed rose to 273 mph. Too fast for a flare. Too slow to outrun. First pair entered firing range. Initial distance 420 yards. converging fast. Hall pulled right. If he made the turn too tight, he'd bleed speed and lose aileron authority. Too wide, and they'd slot in. He pulled anyway. Lightning rolled shallow right, nose down 6 degrees. Airspeed held 272, first FW 190 fired. 20-millimeter burst crossed above his canopy. German expected a dive. Hall hadn't. Second FW 190 adjusted low-angled for a nose cut. Hall forced right rudder against left stick. Nose lifted 3 degrees. Control pressure surged. Compressibility onset. The stick shuddered. The maneuver had begun, but the Germans hadn't seen it yet. They were still aiming at where he should be. Predictive vector fire. It worked against Mustangs, worked against Thunderbolts. But now the geometry was folding. The P-38 yawed left mid-bank, off-axis, cutting through their shared lead cone. The first attacker fired wide. The second began to correct late. Closure collapsed. FW-190 R1 passed under his fuselage by 70 feet. F-190 NAR-2 pulled wide to avoid collision. That left the high pair and the rear fighter still inbound. Hall had just performed the forbidden flare. It worked once, but now the Germans knew he wasn't diving, and they adjusted to follow. At 11,900 feet, the second wave adapted. They dropped flaps, entered shallow turns, and Hall's last trick was now part of their plan. Hall's nose was still pitched up 3 degrees. Airspeed holding at 272 mph as the first wave overshot. For half a second, there was clear sky ahead, no fire, no tracers, no pressure. But it wouldn't last. The second wave, 2 FW-190s in descending echelon, had seen his brake and were adjusting on the fly. Their entry vector was no longer straight. They banked to match his turn. This time, they wouldn't overshoot. They wanted to shadow and squeeze. The P-38's twin booms groaned under strain. Hall still had throttle at 68%, trying to hold energy but not exceed 280 phi Maunip, the known onset zone for control lock. Any more and the flare wouldn't respond. Any less and he'd bleed below the stall-safe threshold. It was a tight box. The third attacker entered at 11,900 feet, angled down 12 degrees, slipping in at 280 mph, slightly above Hall. His plan was clear high side guns pass, firing downward as Hall leveled. It was the counter to the earlier overshoot. But Hall didn't level. He didn't flare either, not yet. Instead, he chopped throttle to 55%, then pulled elevator with a 2-count delay. The nose dipped, then rose again less aggressively this time. Just 2 degrees, then held. At that precise moment, he input 3 degrees on left rudder and a shallow right aileron roll. The aircraft twisted not cleanly, but enough. The P-38 yawed across its own bank line, exposing the belly and dragging sideways. The FW-190 pilot hesitated. His fire angle collapsed. He fired, but the burst went long, trailing behind Hall's left boom by 20 feet. Now the fourth attacker was in range. He had better timing, better spacing, and a better dive angle. Coming from 11,200 feet, nose down at 15 degrees. His closure speed was 340 odds too fast for Hall to use the same move again. The German wasn't aiming at the Lightning's position. He was aiming at where it would yaw. Hall had one option. He kicked hard right rudder too early. Almost a mistake, and the aircraft bucked. Airspeed 276 Mach 8. The tail began to shake. Instead of a clean flare, he triggered a snap. Nose rolled 5 degrees left. Rudder pulled at 8 degrees right, and the plane skidded sideways just enough to shift the enemy's fire line by 4 degrees. The German fired, missed by inches. Hall snapped the stick forward, leveled, rolled 20 degrees left, and dove. His altimeter spun. In 3.4 seconds, he lost 950 feet. The fourth attacker overshot. Now Hall had repositioned low 6 o'clock on the last FW-190. He pushed throttle wide, engines roaring at 100%, chasing the angle, But the fifth German wasn't holding. He rolled hard and climbed, breaking off. Hall didn't fire, he couldn't get clean. But the moment was his. 2 overshoots, 2 missed lead fires, 1 disengaged. The split-bank counter-flare had worked twice, but now they would adapt, and the third wave wouldn't overshoot. They'd shadow, they'd wait, and they'd aim where Hall would be, not where he was. The first wave had failed. The second had missed. But now the fifth FW-190 had seen it all from high 6, watching Hall's P-38 twist and yaw where no lightning should. He wasn't fooled. He rolled out wide at 11,000 feet, then nosed into a shallow dive, keeping Hall in sight but staying outside the flare radius. This was no guns-blazing run. It was a slow stalk. Hall checked 6. The German wasn't charging. He was pacing, mimicking altitude, matching speed. That meant he was preparing for a predictive vector fire, a delayed angle attack to counter the yaw flare. If Hall turned, he'd fire into the gap. If Hall flared again, the German would fire where the lightning would slide. Distance 450 yards and closing. Hall throttled down to 65%, trying to bait the attacker into moving early. But the 190 stayed disciplined. No turn, no dive, just pressure. Then came the change. A second FW-190 entered new contact, 100 feet above, diving in from a high 3 o'clock. They were bracketing. One pinned Hall low and slow, the other dove to finish. The first held steady at 270 bmao. The new attacker came in hotter, 325 mile. Angle of descent 19 degrees. Hall had 6 seconds to react. He went for the flare again, throttle to 52%, nose dip 5 degrees. Then elevator pulled sharp, airspeed 278 me, 8 feet. He began the sequence. Right rudder, left aileron, twist the yaw. Nothing. The stick locked. Compressibility onset, nose stuck. Right rudder had no bite. Flare froze mid-sequence. He was pulling elevator into dead air. The lightning shuddered at 11,500 feet. Stuck in a half-bank dive, the control column vibrated under his gloves. The first FW-190 opened fire, 20 milliliter burst wide left. Missed. The second attacker fired 1 second later clean angle. Tracers slashed beneath Hall's wing root. He banked left hard, hoping for rudder recovery. Instead, the left engine surged. RPM spiked past 3,200. Hall almost rolled inverted. Recovered barely. Airspeed fell to 264 Mach. Now he was too slow for another flare. Too fast to stall turn. And both Germans had the angles. One realigned behind his tail 400 yards and gaining. The second circled wide, setting up a shallow reversal. He had 9 seconds before re-entry. Hall had just bled the one thing he couldn't lose: geometry. The flare, once untrackable, had become readable. The Luftwaffe had learned the angles. And now, instead of forcing overshoots, they were boxing him for the kill. He had 1 shot left, a drop into the vertical. But it meant risking compressibility again. And at 1,100 feet, Hall wasn't sure the lightning could take it. Hall shoved the stick forward, nose down, dive angle steepening to 14 degrees. It wasn't strategy now. It was escape. The airspeed climbed past 285 yimpa, then 290 too fast. The manuals were clear at anything above 282 mup. Control surfaces on the P-38 began to stiffen under compressibility. He was gambling with metal, altitude, and seconds. The German behind him matched the dive, throttled up, diving at 310 Mach, closing the gap. Firing range was now 320 yards and shrinking fast. Hall's lightning trembled. He kicked right rudder, trying to initiate the familiar flare. But the response was delayed 3 seconds. Then nothing. Left engine surged. The propeller over-revved to 3,300 RPM. Torque yaw, twisting the nose 7 degrees and off-axis. He corrected with opposite aileron, but now the aircraft began to vibrate. Badly. Control felt spongy. He checked altimeter 10,600 feet, dropping fast. He needed to level out. He couldn't. The stick was stiff, barely moving. Elevator resistance had tripled. Ailerons pulsed. Right rudder wouldn't respond. Nose pitch stuck at 7 to grind. Then came the warning light. Fuel imbalance. Right tank dropping rapidly, possibly a leak from that burst. Remaining 18% left. 11% right, draining unevenly. The Lightning rolled right without input. Hall pulled hard left to counter strain audible in the frame. The dive deepened. Altitude 9,800 feet, airspeed 301 mph. Now he was inside full compressibility. The P-38 was beginning to gray out. The German behind him fired. 0.5-second burst. Tracers streaked past the left engine, cowling close enough to see the glow. No impact. But the aim was correcting. Hall chopped throttle engines, protested, then yanked back the elevator with all the strength he had, his shoulder locked. The stick moved half an inch. That was enough. Nose pitched up tutic. But the frame didn't follow clean. The Lightning bounced inside its own airflow. One flap fluttered aerodynamic snap. Right rudder caught. But now he was low. Too low. 9,200 feet. If he tried to flare again, he risked blackout or wing stall. Then the fourth FW-190 re-entered from the high right, diving at 340 milliamps. He'd watched the whole dive, waited for Hall to level out, and now slotted into perfect guns range. Hall had no lateral speed, no vertical angle, no altitude. He was boxed. He started to roll right slowly. The German tracked it, closed in. Distance 240 yards. Hall looked up, saw the 190's muzzle flashes first, rounds fired. The last maneuver had failed. He had 1 second to choose hold level and die, or risk a total stall twist under compressibility at 9,000 feet. And the stall window was already closing. The split-bank counterflare wasn't designed. It wasn't charted. It wasn't approved by any tactical doctrine. It was discovered by mistake during a stall recovery test flight in mid-1942 when a P-38 entered a shallow climb at 278 map/hour, encountered control stiffening, and then under cross-control inputs slid sideways in the air. What followed was a partial yaw roll and a vertical pitch bounce. The pilot described it as hitting air that wasn't there. Engineers hated it. The maneuver involved violating 3 prohibitions in the Lightning's handbook. 1, applying elevator, and aileron input in opposition above 270 mmPr 2, inducing yaw under partial compression. 3, holding flare angle through rising torque imbalance. But if you did all 3 at the exact right speed and altitude, you could trick the airflow into momentarily rolling the P-38 laterally off-axis, causing a shallow stall without fully departing flight. The aircraft would appear to yaw and flare simultaneously, throwing off any lead angle based on predictive fire. Here's what had to happen. In order step 1, enter a shallow descent at 275-285 mph, targeting 270 mph by a maneuver onset. Step 2, cut throttle to 50-60% to prevent over-acceleration during the pitch. Step 3, pull elevators sharply, not gradually. Nose up to 24 degrees, just shy of stall brake. Step 4, simultaneously input opposite rudder and aileron, left stick, right pedal, or vice versa. Step 5, hold for 1.4 seconds, then release aileron first, then rudder, then ease off elevator. Done correctly, the aircraft would pitch flare and rotate 40-50 degrees off true vector without climbing or fully spinning. For a chasing fighter, especially one with a higher stall speed or a tighter lead prediction model like the FW-190, this meant the firing solution collapsed. But the risk was extreme. If airspeed exceeded 285 mph, elevator lock began. If it dropped below 260 mph, airflow separation triggered a true stall. If inputs weren't perfectly sequenced, the aircraft could yaw into a flat spin or torque roll violently under asymmetrical thrust. And it only worked between 10,000 and 13,000 feet, where air density and control authority gave just enough margin. Below that, recovery became dicey. No pilot trained for it, no squadron leader approved it, but Hall had felt it once in training when he wasn't supposed to, and now, at 9,100 feet, he had to improvise a version of it far below its safe window. He had only one advantage engine. Torque was already destabilizing the aircraft. If he added just enough rudder, maybe the airframe would twist too much, and he'd spin too little, and he'd be hit. He input the controls anyway, and the P-38 began to slide. 3. The nose was down 7 degrees. Airspeed climbing through 284 mm. Hall's altimeter read 900 feet and dropping fast. The right engine torque had kicked the nose 6 degrees off axis. FW-190 number 4 was closing from 240 yards, tracking high, guns already hot. 2. Hall pulled throttle to 52%, then pitched elevator back with half force, exactly what training said not to do under compressibility. The nose pitched up 2.5 degrees while the frame started to judder. The Lightning was now flying one frame behind its own wake. Control felt delayed, elastic. 1 aileron input, 4 degrees left. Rudder 7 degrees right. The aircraft twisted, not rolled, not a turn and induced yaw flare. The P-38 slipped sideways through its own bank angle. The nose didn't move much, but the nose vector shifted 38 degrees in just under 1.2 seconds. The German's fire line predicted on level banking snapped wide. He fired anyway. Now. Hall felt the tracers scream past. One grazed under the left boom. Distance 130 yards and increasing as the German overshot low left. Hall held flare angle for 0.6 seconds more, then released aileron, eased rudder, and pushed throttle to 78%. The Lightning wobbled, then recovered. He reversed immediately. Nose down 4 degrees, roll right 20 degrees. He now had an open shot on the overshooting 190's rear quarter. Hall fired a 0.7-second burst from all 4.50 cals. Rounds struck the tailplane and right elevator. The FW-190 twisted into a snap roll and began a flat spin. Smoke trailed. At 8,600 feet, it vanished into cloud, confirmed one kill. But it wasn't over. FW-190 MR5, the high staller, had looped wide. He was now re-entering from above. Throttle full, nose pointed straight down, his angle 17 degrees, dive speed 345 map. Hall had no altitude to run, and no time to flare again. He input shallow bank 12 degrees left, pitch 2 degrees, hoping to bait an early fire pass. The German waited. Hall cut throttle, rolled back right, faked a flare angle, then snapped to level. The enemy pilot bit fired early. Tracers passed high, overshoot again. Now Hall dove out throttle wide. Airspeed building past 295 mph. Altitude falling through 700-800 feet. The airframe buzzed, but no control loss. His only chance disengaged before the last 190 reacquired angle. Then a final twist. Hall's ammo indicator blinked 0. He was dry, 1 confirmed kill, 3 failed attacks, 1 disengaged, but now fuel was down to 16%. His right rudder was stiff, and a contact blip appeared at 3 o'clock, low unknown. Range 1.3 miles, closing. He had seconds to decide turn again or vanish. The P-38 was no longer fighting, it was fleeing. Fuel sat at 16% total. But the imbalance was getting worse. Left tank 11%, right tank 5%, and it was dropping faster. That yaw pressure, still present. Hall had to apply constant left aileron just to stay level. Rudder was stiff. Right side control felt delayed, like pushing into sand. He glanced down coolant temp rising on both engines. Left side at 282, right side nearing 245 degrees. Too close to the red line. If one engine failed, he'd never make it back to base, not with that yaw bias. He was 41 miles from home field. But that wasn't the worst of it. The radar contact at 3 o'clock had closed to 0.9 miles. Hall rolled slightly to check visual small, fast, sharp angles. Another FW-190. It hadn't joined the first fight, likely circling, waiting for cleanup. Hall's 50 cals were empty. Every trigger pull brought only the click of dry chambers. He nose-dipped 6-degree, throttle wide open, speed climbing. The airframe moaned under stress. Airspeed surged to 312 mop, then 320. The Germans stayed with him, not firing, just waiting. Hall knew why. He was being shepherded, bleeding fuel, forced low. The 190 would strike when he tried to climb or when an engine faltered. That was the pattern. So Hall did something unexpected. He faked a flare again, nose up 2-degree, minor left rudder, aileron pressure exaggerated. It looked like the beginning of another split bank. The German pulled up slightly, anticipating the yaw. Hall snapped the stick back right, pitched down hard to 10 degrees, and dropped into a steep low dive toward a hill ridge 4.8 miles ahead, hoping to break radar lock. It worked. The FW-190 followed too aggressive. His dive was sharper, but Hall leveled early, skimming at 380 feet, weaving slightly. German radar lost line of sight. He was gone. The last contact stayed airborne, searching, but Hall was already on a low escape vector, heading 145 degree. Altitude steady at 420 feet, fuel dropping to 9%, but distance closing. By 15 minutes later, he crossed into friendly radar cover. A P-47 wing out of Wren confirmed visual. Hall gave hand signals, radio still dead. Touchdown would be another crisis. Right flap was stuck partially down. Fuel was nearly gone, but he'd made it out. Alive, dry, 1 kill, 1 move, and no one would believe what he'd done without the gun camera. He landed with 3% fuel, left engine sputtering, but the tapes were intact, and what they showed made command furious, because it proved the Germans had adapted and still lost, and Hall had broken every rule to do it. Hall's Lightning crossed the airfield boundary at 102 mop, nose high, gear down, 1 flap stuck at 28-degree deployment, right side only. That induced a yaw roll just before touchdown. He corrected with left rudder, but it was still stiff. The aircraft bounced once, settled at 98 mph, and skidded slightly left. He used the full strip, 500 feet of runway, before coming to a halt with less than 20 gallons of fuel remaining. Ground crew surrounded the aircraft, expecting damage. But aside from surface scarring near the left boom and a warped flap, the Lightning was intact. No visible holes. The 50 cals were all empty. One crew chief looked at the ammo counter, then at Hall, and said, "You shot all of them." "Didn't you?" Hall didn't answer. He just stepped out, legs shaking. Total time from enemy contact to wheels down 23 minutes. An intelligence officer took the gun camera film immediately. Hall's debrief began before he could drink water. They watched the footage 3 times. 1 overshoot, 1 enemy spin, 3 attackers disengaging after failed passes, 1 confirmed kill FW-190 spiraling into clouds after tail hits, all within 11 seconds. But what shocked them wasn't the kill. It was how the P-38 moved. "You flared," the operations captain said flatly. Hall nodded. "Yes, sir." "Over 200 Sam. Yes, sir. Around 280. Twice." The room went quiet. A major stepped forward, brows tight. "That maneuver was removed from all tactical briefs last year." "I know, sir." "Why did you use it?" Hall hesitated. Then, because the others didn't work. The major didn't like that answer. His report omitted the flare by name. He filed it as improvised defensive role under high-speed pressure. Later. Higher command reviewed the tape. Official language changed again, energy retention role with yaw offset escape. Nowhere did the term split bank counter flare appear. 3 days later, Hall's tape was archived. marked as unverified anomaly. 2 requests to release it for squadron-level tactics training were denied, but stories spread. Pilots heard. Someone said, "One of ours dodged 5 190s with a crazy yaw move." Another said, "He slid out of their cones, like sideways." And in a tent briefing in western France, a pilot described the move with a shrug. "It's like flaring into a sidestep." I think that's how he did it. Back at base, Hall was reassigned to mid-altitude escort missions. His squadron lead warned him, "No flares. Not again." But the Germans had already seen it, tracked it, and passed it up the chain. Because in Luftwaffe Group West HQ, one report now flagged the P-38 as capable of non-standard yaw maneuvers below 12,000 feet. And that meant every German ace was about to study it. The report never circulated officially, but the tape did. Within 10 days, a duplicate of Hall's gun camera reel was screened unofficially by 2 pilots from the 367th Fighter Group. One of them had a brother in Hall's squadron. They watched the sequence 5 times. No commentary, just the twist, the flare, the overshoots. By the following week, 3 P-38 pilots attempted to reproduce the maneuver in solo test flights above 10,000 feet. Only one succeeded. Capped. Mason Fuller from the 394th managed to recreate a partial yaw slide flare at 278 pipe, pitching just 2.8 degrees with a 6 degrees rudder counter input. He called it riding the wall. He wrote it down in his logbook, and he told no one else except his wingman. By mid-July 1944, ground crews at 2 separate Lightning bases noticed a trend. Pilots were cutting throttle mid-turn more often. They were entering lateral rolls at higher speeds than doctrine allowed. In 3 squadrons, informal diagrams began appearing chalk lines on tent walls, napkin sketches showing yaw curves, pitch arcs, speed windows. They weren't labeled, but they all showed the same sequence flare pitch, then lateral twist. By August, 9 pilots had attempted the maneuver, 6 succeeded. 2 nearly lost control and blacked out, but one, Carl Reiner, used it in live combat over Chartres, under fire from 2 Bf-109s. He input the flare at 272 melops, banked sharp, and snapped into a yaw break. The lead German overshot. Reiner turned the tables and landed a 0.8-second burst. Confirmed kill. His after-action report called it a low-angle brake slide, but his crew chief, he just called it the Hall move. Across the month of August, in units where the tape had been whispered about, a pattern formed. AVAUC survivability in multi-contact engagements, 13,000 FT, units with no exposure, 67%, units where the maneuver was attempted, 84% H, lead angle miss rate by enemy fighters, normal turns 16-22%, twist maneuvers 31-37%. Nothing was official. But the numbers weren't coincidence. Still, leadership pushed back. The maneuver didn't make it into any field manual. Training cadres refused to include it in rotation. The risks, flat spins, unrecoverable dives, asymmetric stalls were too high, so it stayed in whispers. A move you practiced alone, never mentioned by name. A technique passed down tent to tent, over coffee, or under moonlight by the wing of a patched-up Lightning. If your stick starts to lock, they'd say, "Don't freeze. Pull flare, kick slide. Let the airflow do the rest." Hall's name was never spoken, but every pilot who tried it knew where it came from. And those who survived wrote it in their logbooks with one line, "Used the forbidden flare. Lived. Lit." Owen Hall flew 12 more combat missions. None were as deadly as June 6th. He never fired his guns again. His P-38 serial, Schwa 42-67419, was reassigned in August 1944 to a replacement pilot who suffered an engine failure over Belgium. The aircraft crash-landed in a field north of Namur. It was written off 3 days later. Final flight hours, 183.4. Hall himself completed his tour in early 1945. He returned home with no medals, no kill markings, and no official mention of the maneuver that saved him. He never flew fighters again. He left the service at age 22. The maneuver, still unofficial, lingered in back channels. In late 1944, a handful of P-38 pilots, flying cover in the Ardennes, used a version of the flare twist to dodge German fire. They logged it as high-speed bank slide, nose angle offset, or simply the kick. Instructors didn't teach it, but it survived anyway. In 1945, during post-war debriefs with Luftwaffe veterans, one German ace was asked if he ever feared the lightning in a dogfight. He answered no. Unless it started to turn wrong, some of them began to move, sideways. That was not natural. Jet combat would make the maneuver obsolete. With speeds above 500 knots, airflow no longer bent in the same way, but the idea that airflow could be weaponized with timing and nerve never disappeared. Today, test pilots, studying asymmetric stall behaviors in restored warbirds, still reference the old yaw flare effect. They don't call it doctrine. They call it dangerous. But one document archived in a sealed locker at Maxwell Air Force Base shows a frame-by-frame analysis of Hall's gun camera. It ends with a note geometry break detected at 278 E Amorapa. Confirmed overshoot, repeatable unknown, survivor Hall, O, and on the warbird circuit. If you ask certain instructors how to escape a guns tracking dive at low altitude in a twin boomer, they'll pause, then say, "You won't like the answer, but there's one thing you can try." Hall died in 1996, never interviewed. No kill tally, no fame. Just one maneuver, never taught, but still remembered. Mission brief. If you're in a twin-engine fighter at low altitude, no ammo, no speed, and they bracketed your vector, there's one last move left. Flare sharp, kick the rudder, slide the angles, and make them miss.